Hi, this is Bill Guesswich. Let's talk about dependency injection. This video will be broken up into two parts. This part, which will address dependency injection, and then the second part will talk about and give an example of lifetimes of different services within a dependency injection model. The agenda for this video will be: what is dependency injection? What are service lifetimes as it relates to dependency injection? How is dependency injection defined in a .NET Core Blazor application? And what are some special considerations that we need to take into account for Blazor WebAssembly? Now, I'll be referencing the Microsoft resource below, and I'll also put this link in the description. So what is dependency injection? Well, the first thing that I think is always beneficial is to understand the solid design principles. They were developed in early 2000 by Robert C. Martin, affectionately known as Uncle Bob. And they are a set of 5 design principles that any object-oriented application should consider. Now, SOLID is an acronym, and today we're not going to go through all of it, but today we're going to spend time on the D in SOLID, which stands for the Dependency Inversion Principle. And what does that mean? According to Uncle Bob in his 2000 article, Design Principles and Design Patterns, one should depend upon abstractions, not concretions. Or maybe in C# parlance, it's one should depend on interfaces, not on direct classes. Let's break that apart. First of all, what is a dependency? A dependency is an object that another object requires. So for example, as we've been working through some of the Blazor projects, we've seen that Razor components use services that are defined via dependency injection. So those objects, the Razor component, is dependent on or requires the service that we've defined. So that's one example. We also may have in our application an employee object that's dependent on a payroll object in order to pay the employee. And there are a number of different object dependencies that we can talk to. But that's what dependency is. The abstraction that we talk about in the dependency inversion principle is really an interface in the C# language. And we've shown you in interfaces before. We'll actually go through those a little bit more today. So dependency injection is the way to define and use the implementation of an interface that is required by other objects. Why do we need to use dependency injection? Well, there are a number of reasons, but these are 3 that I like to think about. First is that it makes everything more testable. When you define a service via dependency injection, it's very easy to switch out different implementations of that interface, so that when you're testing, for example, if you're testing an object that uses a database object, you may not want to write to the database. Well, you can create a mock repository for that database and easily switch it in by changing a few things within the startup class. So it makes it more testable, makes your whole application more testable. It's easier to maintain and change. Similarly to what we just talked about, since everything's dependent on the interface and not on the underlying class, the classes are easier to change, different implementations are easier to implement, and overall it's just easier to maintain. And the third reason is you may want to have objects live for different lifetimes, and by specifying the service lifetime within the dependency injection declaration or definition, you can have your object live for and we'll talk about it. There's 3 different types of lifetime. So that's a little bit about what dependency injection is. And here, let's talk a little bit about the service lifetimes. So there are 3 types of service lifetimes. The first is the singleton, which, when it gets defined, it actually lives through the entire life of the service container. And in many cases, in a .NET Core application, that's the life of the application. When it starts up, as we've shown in some of our other videos, we start up a host builder, and that host builder stays around to respond to requests. And when that host goes away, then the object goes away, but the application essentially ends. So singleton is the first one. Scoped is the second, which says it's part of, it lives through the duration of the request. And what we'll see in Blazor, that may take on a slightly different meaning as we look at some of the examples, but we'll talk about that as well. But essentially, a scoped dependency injection or scope service would exist from the beginning of the request through to the end of the request. And you may want to do that for certain reasons along the way. The last lifetime is transient. That says that every time you create or you request the object, you're getting a new instance of that object. And I have an example that we'll cover a little bit later in this video that'll take you through the lifetimes and show you an example of just a person service that I show that has a singleton life, a scope life, and a transient life. And I'll show you how the first name property of that object reacts. Let's go into Visual Studio and see how we define dependency injection. Here we are in Visual Studio. Let's start by doing a File, New, Project. We'll do a Blazor app, which hopefully for you, now that we've been doing a number of these, they'll be in your recent project templates. If not, go ahead and search for it. Let's click on Next. Let's call this Dependency Injection Example. We'll create that. We'll make it a Blazor server app. Let's create that. Okay. So first, let's go down to the startup and let's take a look down here in the Configure Services method. And you'll notice that there's a services parameter, which is of type iService collection. That's what we're going to use for the dependency injection. And if you notice, there is actually one already defined for us. It's a singleton of type weather forecast service, and that's the definition. Now I'm going to show you in the resource that Microsoft provided multiple ways you can define services in dependency injection, and that's one of them as a singleton. But let's not use that. Let's go and create our own. So first thing I like to do, let's right click on the project. Let's add, and we'll add a new folder. Let's call it Services. And let's go ahead and right click on that, add new item. And let's first start with a class, and let's call it the person service. Now this is the person service, and we could start just by doing something like this, where we say public string first name get set, and let's do a public void walk, and we won't define that right now. So we have a very simple service that has a first name field and a walk method. Now, there are multiple ways that we can define this. So if we go to, let's go to the pages, and let's go to the index page. Let's add in the @code, and what we could do is say person service person, and notice that's going to give us a red squiggly. And why? Hopefully by now you know it's because within the imports Blazor file I need to add @using dependency injection example.services. Okay, let's save that. We'll go back to index. That's already gone to green, and there we go. Equals new person service. Okay, now that we've done that, let's create a public. Well, actually, let's go ahead and just override the uninitialized. And here we can say person dot, and notice we have access to first name and we have access to walk. However, a couple of things about this, the way to implement it. This is totally fine for a very simple service, but it is not injected through dependency injection. First of all, you don't have an interface. And second of all, we've defined it here, and we will, at the end of this code, it will go away. So that may be fine for your purpose, but this isn't defining it as dependency injection. So let's do it a slightly different way. And first thing I want to note is, let's get rid of that. Actually, we're going to keep the uninitialized, and let's go to the startup class. In the startup class, as I mentioned before, we have this configure services section here, and we have services.add singleton, weather forecast service, and that is a way to define it. So let's go ahead and define it that way. Services.add singleton, we'll go ahead and say that, and we'll call this person service, and we'll get the red squiggly, and let's use our favorite friend control dot, and that just adds the using, and there we go. So now the person service is injectable. And what does that mean? Well, we can go over here, and as part of this we can say @inject person service, notice it came up, and person. All right, and then down here let's put person dot, and there we have it. Okay, so now this will live on for the life of the application as opposed to just for the life of this page. All right, so that's one way to define a service. But as we talked about previously, we did not define it at the abstract level, the interface level. We defined it at the concrete level. And a couple of things to consider. Let me go over to the Microsoft resource. So here, this is the other resource that I have the link in the description for, Dependency Injection ASP.NET Core. I want to go down to service lifetimes, and I want to scroll down just a little bit further. And I think this chart is very, very good. It's under service registration methods. And what it does is it defines for you different ways that you can define methods in dependency injection, and more importantly, the different features of the different definitions. So for example, in this way, which is add lifetime, So add scoped or add singleton, and then the service and the implementation. So a good example here is services.add singleton, my dep or my dependency, and then my dependency is the implementation of that. When you do it that way, you get automatic object disposal. You can have multiple implementations of my dep, but you can't pass any arguments. Now let's compare that to what we were using in the application so far. We were using the actual implementation here, add singleton, in quotes, the implementation. What you get there is automatic object disposal still, yes. Multiple implementations, no. And can you pass arguments? No. So you miss out on doing it on multiple implementations if you do it that way. So you just want to consider the different ways you define it when you're looking at this. And we'll come back here in a little bit as we continue to look at different ways to define it. So back in the application, let's go ahead and get rid of that. I never like to inject something where I just have the basically the class name here, not the interface, but the class name. So let's get rid of this now. And let's go over here to the services and let's add in a new item. Let's add in a class. We'll call it iPersonService. Now this will be an interface. And we will say that it has, now remember in an interface it's all public. So we're going to say we have a string, first name, get set, and we also have a void walk, and that's it. There's the interface. Let's go back to person service, and let's say that this person service implements iPersonService. And now we have the contract defined in iPersonService and person service defined here. So now let's go back to the startup class and look at different ways that we can define person service there. So we can do the same thing with add singleton, but now we can say iPersonService, comma, person service. Go back to index razor and we can say at inject iPersonService person, and we put it here, whoops, person dot, and we have access to the first name, property, and the walk method. Okay, so that's another way to do it. Now let's say we don't want to, we're testing and we don't want to do all of the logic that's in iPersonService. So we want to create like a mock person service. We can do new class mock, let's call it mock person service. Now again, this won't be a great example because we aren't doing anything in person service, but we can say iPersonService, so it implements iPersonService. And again, we'll do the property. We'll do a string, call it first name, and we will add a public void walk method. And presumably we wouldn't do anything here. We would do something in the other person service, so that this really is just a stub or a mocked up service. So what we could do is if we were testing or we wanted to swap it out for some period of time, we go back to the startup class, and all we would need to do is change this to mock. Let's go mock. And then if over here in index razor, if we define, we wouldn't have to change the inject at all. It still works fine. And over here, we could have person dot, and we would have access to the first name, to walk, and so forth. Okay? So that's one of the benefits as well of using dependency injection. So let's go back to the startup. Let's change this to person service. And let's say we want to pass in, we won't use mock person service anymore. We'll just leave that there for now. Let's go to person service, and let's say we have a constructor in person service. All right, CTOR. And let's say we want to pass in a string to that, and we'll pass in the first name. So we pre-populate it. Well, we've seen something similar to this in an earlier video when we were looking to pass in the URL to the API services that we were creating. But here we'll say first name equals F name. Okay. Well, how do I get that parameter in there? Let's go to the Microsoft resource again. Let's look at these service registration methods. And let's take a look at this one here. If you notice, it says add lifetime, the service, SP, and equals new, or lambda equals new implementation. And there are two different ways, services.add singleton with the interface, SP equals new with the actual implementation, and that has no constructor parameter, and this one does. So let's go ahead and do that one. So we talked about this being like this. We close that off. We open the paren and we say, SP new, and we'll call it person service. And since it takes, now notice as soon as I do that, it tells me it needs a first name, so we'll say Fred. Fred. And we'll close that off. Okay, no red squigglies. Let's go over here into index. We've injected it here. Let me put a breakpoint right here, and let's run the code. So when we do that, let's hover over person. We see we've got person, and we've got first name is already populated with Fred, and that's because it was done within the dependency injection. Okay, so those are a couple of different ways to define services within a .NET Core application. Now there are a couple of things to consider when we talk about dependency injection, especially as it relates to Blazor WebAssembly. And here's the resource, and let's go over to that resource and take a look. So here we are in the Microsoft resource, ASP.NET Core Blazor Dependency Injection. I'd like to go down to the add services to an app, and let's scroll down a little bit to get to, see there's a lot of good information, but this is what I wanted to show, the service lifetime. And if you notice, Blazor WebAssembly apps don't currently have a concept of DI scopes. The scoped, in essence, becomes singleton, and that's important to notice. So you've got scoped here, you've got singleton, and you have transient, but as in essence, scoped and singleton are very, very similar. Now this document has a lot of good information, so I would recommend you check it out, and I've included the link in the description below. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact me. And as always, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.